The first thing I noticed about the bunker wasn't the door. It was the smell. Cold concrete and something underneath it. Not rot, not mold exactly, more like old air that hadn't moved in 40 years. Sealed-in air. The kind that sits in a space long enough that it stops being air and starts being atmosphere. I know that sounds like I'm making it poetic, and I'm really not. I've crawled into enough HVAC systems, enough boiler rooms, enough mechanical spaces nobody else wanted to go near to know what sealed-in air smells like. It smells like time. It smelled like a lot of time. I almost didn't find it at all. That sounds like I'm building to something dramatic, and I guess I am. But the actual truth is, I found it because I was looking for a tree to pee behind. That's it. That's the whole story of how I discovered the thing that kept me alive through the worst winter I've ever seen. I needed to pee. I walked 30 feet off the trail I'd been following through the woods, and my boot went through a layer of frozen leaves and hit metal underneath. Not dirt, not rock, metal. Hollow underneath it, the way a drum sounds different when it's empty. I stood there for a second, just kind of looking at my foot. Then I kicked the leaves away. I should back up though, because by the time I found that door in the woods, it was already October, and I'd been on my own for nearly 6 weeks, and 6 weeks of that particular October felt about equivalent to 6 years of regular life. Everything was compressed. Every day had this weight to it that normal days just don't have, where you make 50 decisions before noon, and every single one of them actually matters. Not like work used to matter. Work used to matter in this abstract sense, where if you messed up a job, you'd get a bad review or lose a client. This was different. This was the kind of mattering where the wrong decision means you don't get to make another one. So let me start from the beginning, or close to the beginning, because there isn't really a clean beginning. It started coming apart in pieces, and I only understood what was happening after the fact, the same way you only understand a car crash after you've already hit the other vehicle. My name is Dale Hurst. I'm 38 years old, or I was 38 when this started. I'm 39 now, I think, though the birthday came and went somewhere in December, and I only realized it had passed about a week later. I spent 16 years doing HVAC and building maintenance. Started right out of community college, got my certifications, worked for a company called Trident Mechanical for 11 years, and then went independent. I liked the independent part. I liked driving to a job by myself, figuring out what was wrong, fixing it, driving to the next one. I liked that nobody was looking over my shoulder. I liked that I knew something most people didn't. How buildings breathe, how they circulate heat and air and water, all the invisible systems that keep a structure alive and comfortable. And most people have no idea exist until they break. I was good at it. That's not bragging, that's just true. I could walk into a mechanical room I'd never seen and have a pretty solid read on the whole building's systems within about 20 minutes. The way pipes ran, the age of the equipment, whether the previous guy who worked on it knew what he was doing or was just winging it. Buildings have signatures. Once you know how to read them, every building tells you its whole history. That's the only reason I survived the first part of this. Not courage, not luck, not weapons training, just that specific skill set and the habit of paying attention to things other people ignore. I was in Garfield County when it started. I know, the name is not exactly famous. It's a mid-sized county in the part of the state that people drive through to get somewhere else. There's a lot of farmland, some small industrial operations, a few bigger towns along the highway corridor. I'd been living there for 3 years. After my divorce from Carrie, I sold the house in the city and moved out here partly to cut my expenses and partly because I wanted quiet. I wanted to not be somewhere that reminded me of everything I'd let slide while I was working 60-hour weeks and telling myself that work was the important thing. Carrie took the dog. I want to note that. I'm not bitter about the marriage ending. I understand how that happened, and I own my part in it. But I am still a little bitter about the dog. Anyway, I was living in a rental house just outside a town called Pemberton, population about 9,000, doing commercial and residential HVAC work across 3 counties. It was a good enough life, quiet. Maybe too quiet some days, but quiet. The first signs were confusing because they were confusing to everyone. That's important to understand. This wasn't something that you could clearly see coming if you were paying attention. Or maybe it was, and none of us were paying the right kind of attention. There'd been news stories about a respiratory illness spreading through a city about 400 miles east of us. Then stories about the illness behaving strangely. Then stories about infected individuals becoming violent. Then the stories started not making complete sense. Like whoever was writing them didn't fully understand what they were describing or was being told not to say certain things directly. I remember the exact moment I started taking it seriously. I was on a job, a commercial refrigeration repair at a grocery distribution warehouse on the south side of Pemberton. And the warehouse manager, guy named Patrick, big guy, always wore the same faded blue jacket, came out to where I was working and said the company was sending people home and closing the facility until further notice. He looked scared in a way that felt different from regular scared. Not scared of something specific, scared of something undefined, which is worse. I drove home. I had about 2 weeks of regular food in the house, which is more than most people, but not because I was a prepper or anything, just because I bulk buy and I don't cook fresh every day. I checked my water situation. I had a couple of cases of bottled water and access to a well, which was good. I had tools. I had a workshop in the back of the house with enough materials to be useful. I had 2 hunting rifles I never used, left behind by the previous tenant, and technically mine now because I'd found them in a locked cabinet and landlord had no idea they were there. I had about 300 rounds of .308 for those rifles because when I found them, I'd bought ammunition on the logic that if I was going to have guns, I should have something to put in them. None of that felt like enough. When the TV stopped broadcasting regular programming and the internet started going patchy, and then the power went out on the 3rd day. The power coming back on intermittently over the next week was almost worse than it just staying off. You'd get 2 hours of electricity, and in those 2 hours, you'd catch fragments of news that were always worse than the last, fragments you'd seen, and then the power would cut, and you'd be sitting in the dark with the latest terrible information, and no update coming. What I understood from those fragments, it's spread faster than anyone expected. It spread through bites. That was confirmed early, and confirmed hard when you saw footage of what happened in crowded places. It spread through whatever the illness was before the aggression started, because by the time someone was showing the aggression, they'd been incubating it for days and walking around being normal-seeming and infectious. The infected weren't dying, not from the infection itself. They were changing. Their behavior was changing in ways that made them extremely dangerous and completely unreachable. I saw footage on one of those 2-hour power windows of a parking lot outside a hospital. About 200 people in that parking lot, all of them moving wrong. That specific kind of movement, the directionless, seeking, the locked-on lunge when something living crossed their path. I can't describe it in a way that fully captures what it does to your stomach the first time you see it. Your brain tries to categorize what it's seeing. It looks almost like a person. It moves almost like a person. But something is switched off behind the eyes, and the movements have no purpose beyond the next stimulus. It's not like seeing a monster. It's like seeing a person with everything that makes them a person surgically removed. I stopped watching after a while. Watching wasn't helping me. Moving was helping me. I spent a few days of real chaos doing what I knew how to do, assessing, planning, fixing what I could. I cut off the water to the house and filled every container I had, including the bathtub, because I knew the municipal water pressure would fail eventually. And it was better to have it stored. I went through my tools and packed the ones I'd actually need. Cordless drill, impact driver, multimeter, wire strippers, pipe cutters, a set of hand tools, a pipe threader. I packed them like I was going to a job. Because I was going to a job. The job was just keeping myself alive. I did 2 runs to nearby properties before the situation in town got too dangerous to move around freely. The first run was to an empty farmhouse about 1.5 miles down the road. The family that lived there had left. I could tell by the open front door and the car missing from the driveway. I went in quickly, took canned goods from their pantry, a propane camping stove, extra blankets, their medicine cabinet contents, and about 40 pounds of rice and dried beans I found in a large plastic bin in their basement. I also took their chainsaw, which I figured I'd need eventually, and 2 5-gallon fuel cans that were full of gasoline. Took me maybe 20 minutes. I felt bad about the food. I don't feel bad about it now, but I did then. The second run was to a farm supply store about 4 miles out. I went in the truck, drove fast, didn't stop. The store was mostly cleaned out of the obvious stuff. Bottled water, canned goods, anything people thought to grab in the first panic. But the farm supply section still had plenty of useful material. I took a hand pump sprayer that I figured I could rig for water delivery. I took rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. I took every battery I could find, all sizes. I took 2 boxes of heavy-gauge wire. I took a bag of agricultural lime, which I knew could help with sanitation issues. I took a portable DC water pump meant for transferring fuel or water between tanks. That pump turned out to be important later. On the way back from that second run, I passed 2 of them on the road. They were just standing in the middle of the 2-lane county road, maybe 50 feet apart from each other, not interacting with each other. One was a man in work clothes, heavy canvas pants, boots, a jacket with a logo on the back I couldn't read. The other was a woman in pajamas, with a heavy coat thrown over them like she'd grabbed it on the way out of somewhere. They both turned when I came around the bend. That's when you really understand the speed. I'd heard people say they move fast, and I thought fast meant jogging speed. It doesn't. It means the space between calm and attacking is about half a second, and there's no warning between the 2 states. I didn't stop. I swerved onto the shoulder, got around them, drove. In my rear view, I could see them both turned and following the truck's direction down the road, not chasing. They couldn't outrun the truck, but oriented toward the sound I'd made, locked onto it until something else came along. I got home. I sat in the truck in my driveway for about 10 minutes. I wasn't scared exactly, or I was scared, but it was this flat, functional kind of scared that felt more like being very cold than like panic. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. I was just running through what I'd seen and what it meant for my plans, and whether my plans needed adjusting. My plans needed adjusting. Staying in that house wasn't sustainable. It was visible from the road, it had glass on most sides, and it was close enough to Pemberton that as the situation there got worse, the density of infected moving outward from town was going to increase. I'd already heard them at night, that particular sound they make, that I'm not going to try to describe in clinical terms, because there's no clinical way to describe it. You hear it once and your hindbrain lights up in a way that bypasses any rational processing. It's the oldest alarm system a human being has, and it works. So I had been thinking, for about 2 weeks, that I needed to find somewhere better. I'd been driving around the back roads when it felt safe enough to move, not looking for people. I didn't have the resources to help people. And I knew that about myself. It wasn't callousness. It was math. I was looking for a structure I could make defensible with the skills I had. An old barn set back from the road, a workshop with solid walls, a basement with good access and exits. I'd found a few candidates and rejected all of them for various reasons. Wrong position, wrong visibility, no good water source nearby. Then October hit hard and fast, the way it does in this part of the country. And I started thinking about heat. The houses I'd been considering weren't insulated well enough to hold heat through a real winter without power. I could burn wood, sure, but burning wood in an uninsulated structure is like trying to heat the outdoors. The smoke visibility was also a problem. Smoke means fire, fire means people, and people, by this point, were not reliably safe. I was getting anxious about the winter problem. That was the specific worry pressing on me every night. Not the infected, not running out of food, but the cold. Cold is slow, but it's absolutely reliable. Cold doesn't have bad luck. Cold doesn't miss. I needed underground. Underground meant naturally insulated, naturally hidden, naturally temperature stable. There are old root cellars and storm shelters scattered all over this county. I knew that, but most of them were small and connected to houses that were either occupied or compromised. I needed something bigger, something with existing infrastructure. And then I was walking off a trail to find a tree to pee behind, and my boot hit that piece of metal. I cleared the leaves off a section about 6 feet square before I understood what I was looking at. A hatch, heavy steel, the kind you see on old industrial equipment or military installations, with a recessed handle that had been so thoroughly covered by leaf litter and soil creep that it had become invisible from above. The metal was corroded but solid. No real rust through, just surface oxidation that told me it was probably a zinc or cadmium alloy coating over the steel, the kind of coating they used in government construction in the 50s and 60s. Government construction. I looked around. The woods I was standing in were mixed hardwood, old growth mixed with younger regrowth, on a slight rise above a creek drainage. I'd been following a deer trail that connected to an old logging road. There was nothing obvious to suggest anything had been here, which was of course the whole point. I turned the recessed handle. It wasn't locked. Or it had been locked at some point, some internal mechanism that was supposed to keep it secured. But time and disuse had worked on whatever locking mechanism it had, and the handle turned with resistance, but it turned. I heaved. The hatch was probably 140 pounds, and it had 4 decades of atmospheric pressure. Differential working against me, but it came up with a sound like a seal breaking. A soft, deep exhalation, like the space below was finally breathing. The smell hit me immediately. Cold concrete, old air. Something that might have been lubricating oil long since dried. Something that might have been old paper. I stood there looking down into darkness and listening. Nothing moving below, nothing at all. I had a headlamp in my pack. I always carry one, habit from years of going into mechanical spaces. I put it on, checked my rifle, went down. The ladder was steel rungs welded into the concrete wall, about 18 feet deep, and at the bottom was a room. A proper room, not a hole, not a cave. Concrete walls, concrete ceiling, concrete floor, all poured solid, all intact. The room was maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, and completely empty except for a bank of old electrical panels along one wall and 2 interior doors, both steel, both closed. I stood in that room for a long time, just sweeping the headlamp around and processing. The panels were old, clearly original installation, mid-century hardware, big boxy relay switches and fuse blocks that predated circuit breakers in the modern sense. But the wiring was intact. Bundles of heavy copper conductor running to junction boxes to conduit that disappeared into the walls and ceiling. Everything was dusty, but nothing had been damaged by water or rodents. The room was dry, and it had stayed dry for a very long time. I tried the first interior door. It opened into a corridor about 15 feet long, with 2 more doors off it. Behind the first of those, a room about half the size of the main entry, with steel shelving along 3 walls and a floor drain in the center. Storage room. Behind the second, a bathroom. An actual bathroom, small but complete, toilet, sink, a shower stall barely big enough to turn around in. The plumbing was all capped and dry, but it was there. I went back to the main room and tried the second door. This one opened into a longer corridor, maybe 40 feet, and at the end of it were 2 more rooms. The first was larger, maybe 30 by 40, with welded steel anchors in the floor and ceiling that I recognized as tie-downs for equipment. Generator room, or it had been. No generator, but the tie-downs were there, and the ventilation ports in the ceiling were there. The second room at the end was smaller, maybe 15 by 15, and it had old bunk frames welded to the walls. 4 bunks total. Accommodation room. I did a slow full circuit of the whole facility. Total usable space. Roughly 2,000 square feet of reinforced concrete, built into a hillside, accessed by a single hatch, with separate storage and accommodation areas, a bathroom with plumbing already installed, and an old electrical system that might still be functional if I could get power to it. The ventilation system, and there was a ventilation system. I found the ductwork running through every room, big square galvanized steel ducts, old but present, had been passive originally, running up through the hillside to surface vents I'd have to find from above. It could be converted to mechanical if I had a small fan and power. I sat on the floor of the accommodation room in the dark, and I thought about this for a very long time. Then I went back up, pulled the hatch closed behind me, and started walking back to my truck. I had work to do. That was October 14th. I know the date because I wrote it down that night. The first entry in the yellow legal pad I'd been using as a log. Before that date, the log was just sparse practical notes, inventory, run outcomes, observations. After October 14th, it became something more regular. I needed to track what I was doing, and when and why, partly for practical reasons, and partly because I was starting to worry about what happens to a person's thinking when they spend too much time alone. Writing things down kept me anchored. I didn't move in immediately. That would have been stupid. I needed to assess the facility fully. I needed to bring the right equipment, and I needed to make sure I wasn't moving into a place that had a problem I couldn't solve. So, I spent the next 3 days doing preparation runs, and every time I went to the bunker, I brought my inspection gear and worked deeper into the systems. The electrical system was my first real concern. Cold War-era wiring, 40-plus years of no maintenance, unknown whether the panels were still safe to energize. I spent most of one full afternoon tracing the circuits, checking every connection point I could access, looked for insulation degradation or rodent damage or moisture intrusion at the junction boxes. What I found was better than I expected. The original installers had used military specification wiring, heavier gauge than residential, better insulation, metal conduit throughout. The conduit had protected the wire from the few spots where moisture had found its way in. Nothing I found suggested immediate fire risk if I brought power to the system, though I'd want to replace a few of the oldest connections before I loaded the circuits. Power itself was the next problem. The facility had originally been connected to a dedicated power line. I found the service entrance conduit running up through the hillside to a munder, point about 30 feet north of the hatch, where it terminated in an underground junction I'd need to excavate to access. That line was dead, obviously. The utility company was not currently sending anyone to restore service. What the facility had was mounting infrastructure for a generator. What I needed was an actual generator. I had a small portable one at the house, a 3,500-watt unit I'd used for power outages. Not enough to run the full facility, but enough to power lights, the ventilation fan if I installed one, and a few key outlets. I'd also seen, on my farm supply store run, a much larger generator, a 10,000-watt propane unit, commercial grade, still in its crate, because it was too heavy for one person to move without equipment, and, presumably, whoever had cleaned out the store hadn't managed it either. That generator, if I could get it out of the store and into the bunker, would change everything. The water system was my other big worry. The facility had plumbing, but no active water source. The pipes ran to caps at every fixture, suggesting the water had been cut off at the main rather than the individual fixtures. I traced the main supply line back through the wall it disappeared into, and found, in the generator room ceiling, a water storage tank, a 100-gallon galvanized steel tank, bolted to the ceiling joists, with inlet and outlet lines and a float valve mechanism that had ceased from disuse, but could probably be freed with penetrating oil and patience. Above that tank, above the ceiling, the supply line continued up through the hillside to somewhere on the surface, capped and buried. So, no active water source, but a distribution system that would work fine if I had a way to fill the tank, which I could do with that portable DC pump I'd picked up at the farm supply store. Assuming I had a water source to pump from. The creek was about 150 feet downhill from the hatch. If I ran a line from the creek to the hatch area and pumped up to the storage tank, I'd have gravity-fed water to every fixture in the facility. That was the plan. It was a lot of work, but it was all work I could do. That's the thing about being an HVAC and mechanical tech. You look at a broken system and you see a list of steps, not an obstacle. The steps might be hard, they might be time-consuming, they might require resources you have to go find. But they're steps. You go through them. I did 4 major equipment runs before I moved in. Run 1 was back to my house to load everything I was definitely taking. All my tools, all my stored food, all my ammunition, both rifles, the portable generator, every battery I had, the plastic sheeting, the wire, all my bedding, my clothing, my legal pad and pens, a first aid kit I'd assembled over the years. That was frankly better than what you'd find in a standard kit, because I'd been adding to it for a while. Loading the truck took most of a morning. I kept stopping to listen. The sounds from toward Pemberton had been getting worse over the past week. Not louder exactly, more varied, more directions. I'd heard what I was pretty sure was gunfire, short bursts, a couple of times in the past few days, and then nothing. The gunfire stopping was worse than the gunfire. I drove to the bunker location, parked the truck off the logging road behind a stand of cedar trees that screened it from casual sight, and started hauling. 18 feet down a ladder is not a short carry for heavy boxes of canned goods and tools. I made about 20 trips, each way, over a period of 4 hours, and by the time I was done my back was making its feelings very clear. I was not 22 anymore. Run 2 was back to the farm supply store for the big generator. That was a 2-person job if you were being sensible about it, which meant it was an extremely difficult 1-person job. I found a 2-wheel dolly in the store's loading area, which helped. Getting the generator crate off the pallet and onto the dolly took me 45 minutes and 1 moment of genuine terror when the crate shifted wrong and nearly came down on my legs. Getting it into the truck bed involved a combination of the dolly, some wooden planks as a ramp, a come-along winch I found in the store's hardware section, and a significant amount of language I would not have used in polite company. I also took, on that run, every propane cylinder in the store, all sizes, which amounted to a substantial amount of fuel. Maybe $600 worth at old prices. I took more agricultural lime. I took a hand-operated water pump, a siphon kit, and about 200 feet of half-inch flexible tubing. I took a box of connectors and fittings that would let me adapt the tubing to the water pipes in the bunker. I took 24 boxes of canning jar lids, which I'd need later for food storage. I also, while I was there, found something I hadn't expected. In a back storage room, behind a shelving unit of livestock supplements, a sealed cardboard box that turned out to contain seeds. Agricultural seeds, not the kind you'd plant for a garden, the big bulk seed lots for field planting. Barley, winter wheat, oats, turnips, kale, radishes. They were in sealed foil packets inside the box, and the box had been sitting in a climate-controlled storage room, so they were probably still viable. I don't know what made me take them. I had no immediate plan for a garden. I was thinking about the next week, maybe the next month, not the spring. But I took them anyway, because they were there, and they weighed almost nothing, and something in the back of my head said, "You'll want those." That turned out to be one of the better instincts I've had. Run 3 was harder. I'd heard more sounds from toward town, and the infected were definitely ranging farther out from Pemberton now. I saw 3 on the road during this run, 2 together moving along the shoulder, 1 standing in the middle of a field just off the road, not moving, just standing facing west with no apparent reason. That standing still one bothered me more than the ones that were moving. I don't know why. Maybe because the moving ones were doing something you could track and anticipate. The one that was just standing there, staring at nothing, reminded me of something wrong with a computer, waiting for an input that wasn't coming. Run 3's primary target was a hardware store in a small town called Greer, about 8 miles from the bunker location. The hardware store was a family-owned operation I'd been to a few times for supplies. Older stock, not a big chain, which meant they carried things the chains had stopped stocking. What I needed was ventilation hardware, a centrifugal blower fan that could move air through the bunker's ductwork, controls, and wiring for it, and ideally some way to filter the incoming air. The store was empty of people, not ransacked, just empty. Like everyone who worked there had simply left. The lights were off. The registers were still at their stations. There was an open coffee cup on the counter behind the register that had grown a thick skin across the top of the cold liquid. I moved through fast, found the ventilation section, took 2 blower fans and the associated hardware. I took a coil of heavy-gauge wire, a box of electrical connectors, a bag of duct tape, and several rolls of HVAC foil tape. In the plumbing section, I found exactly what I needed for the water line from the creek: brass fittings, flexible connector hose, and a foot valve with a screen on it that would let me intake water from the creek without pulling in sediment. I also took a box of pipe dope and a roll of PET tape, because those things are like gold when you're doing field plumbing. The hardware store also had propane, which I'd hoped for. 3 full 100-pound cylinders standing behind the store in a fenced propane yard that I just cut the lock on. Getting those into the truck was its own project. They weighed about 170 pounds each full, and I used a hand truck from inside to the store to get each one to the truck tailgate, then a combination of leverage and brute stubbornness to get them into the bed. I was loading the last cylinder when I heard movement from around the side of the building. I had the rifle slung over my shoulder, and I unslung it as I turned, not bringing it up yet, just having it ready. What came around the corner was a dog. A big golden retriever, medium old, probably 9 or 10 years, wearing a collar with a tag. He walked right up to me and sat down and looked at me with the particular expression that dogs have. That means I have decided you're okay. I stared at that dog for a long time. I didn't take him. I've thought about that decision plenty, and I still don't know if it was right or wrong. The practical arguments against. Another living thing in the bunker means another mouth to feed, means noise I can't control, means complications I couldn't predict. The practical arguments for: dogs hear things humans don't. Dogs provide psychological value that I was probably going to need more than I could admit. At that moment, dogs are good. I told myself I'd think about it. I got in the truck. The dog sat there and watched me drive away. He didn't chase the truck. He just sat there. I've thought about that dog probably more than I've thought about almost anything else from the first part of this. I named him in my head. I named him Gary. I'm sorry, Gary. Run 4 was the most dangerous, and the one I almost didn't come back from. I needed fuel. The big propane generator was going to be my primary power source, and while I had a good amount of propane, a 10,000 watt generator burns through propane faster than you'd think. At full load, maybe a gallon an hour, which is not actually that much per unit but adds up quickly over weeks. I wasn't going to run it continuously. I'd run it in timed cycles to charge batteries and handle the heavy loads, which would extend my fuel supply significantly. But I still needed more because winter was coming, and I didn't know how long I'd be underground, and I did not want fuel to be the limiting factor. There was a propane distribution facility, not a full depot, a regional supply station, about 12 miles east. A single-story commercial property with a fenced tank yard, 3 large storage tanks, and a dispensing pump. I'd noticed it on jobs in that direction. I didn't know how much was in the tanks, but the property looked maintained up until maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, which suggested the tanks weren't empty. I went on a Thursday morning, leaving before full light. I was 2 miles from the property, on a county road I'd used before with no problems, when the road was blocked. Not blocked by infected. Blocked by a vehicle, a large pickup truck parked sideways across both lanes with a concrete block holding the accelerator. Down, behind it, partially screened by the truck, but visible once I slowed and really looked. 3 men standing in the ditch. One of them had a rifle up. I stopped. I sat there. The man with the rifle walked to the front of the blocked truck and stood there, not pointing the rifle at me, but definitely holding it in a ready position. I rolled down my window. He was maybe 50, heavy-set, work-worn face, wearing a blaze orange hunting vest over a canvas jacket. "Where are you going?" he called. "East, toward the propane station." A pause. He looked back at the other 2 men. One younger, maybe mid-20s, one about my age. "That property's ours," he said. "We're controlling distribution from there." I looked at him. I thought about this. "I wasn't planning to take everything," I said. "I just need to fill some cylinders." "Everybody needs to fill cylinders," he said. "That's why we're controlling it." I waited a beat. "Are you selling access? Bartering?" He looked at the younger man. They had a short conversation I couldn't hear. Then he looked back at me. "What have you got?" I had food, tools, ammunition, propane I'd already collected, and the general rule from everything I'd read about these situations, that trading from strength was better than trading from desperation. I also had the practical assessment that I could not take 3 armed men from a stationary vehicle position, and I shouldn't try. "Food," I said. "Canned goods. What's your rate?" What followed was a negotiation that lasted about 20 minutes, conducted through my truck window with a rifle pointing generally in my direction, which was not ideal. But it was a negotiation, and that meant these were functional people making rational decisions, which, in the context of everything going on, was actually a relief. His name was Ray. He'd been managing that propane station for 11 years. When things fell apart, he'd gone there first, because it was familiar, and he knew the value of what was there. He had his son Travis and his neighbor Brett with him, and they'd established what was effectively a toll operation, not exploitative, from what I could tell. They were charging fair rates in food or other useful supplies for propane access. They were being consistent about it, and they were keeping records in a spiral notebook. I traded 2 cases of canned goods, tuna, beans, soup for filling rights to all the cylinders I'd brought, which came to a substantial amount of propane. While my cylinders were filling, Ray and I talked. He told me things had been worse in town than I knew. The initial chaos had given way to something organized, but not in a reassuring way. Several groups of armed men had moved through the area, not survivors trying to help each other, but people who'd decided that the collapse of institutions meant they could operate however they wanted. 2 families he knew had been driven out of their properties at gunpoint. He also told me something I hadn't heard yet. There was a radio signal, an actual broadcast signal, not just the emergency broadcast system's automated loop that had been running for the first week and then fallen silent. An actual voice on AM frequency coming out of somewhere about 60 or 70 miles north. He'd been listening to it in the evenings. He gave me the frequency. I wrote it down. I also told him where I was generally based, not specifically, not the bunker, but the general area, in case either of us needed to find the other. I left him the second rifle from my house, which I'd been carrying as a backup. He looked at it for a long time. "You sure about this?" he said. "I have another one," I said. He nodded. He said thank you. That was the first time anyone had said thank you to me since this all started, and I wasn't prepared for how much it landed. I drove back. On the way, about 3 miles from the bunker, I passed a section of road I'd used before and found it different. The fence line on the left side of the road had been pushed down in a section about 40 feet wide, and through the gap and into the field beyond, I could see a cluster of infected. 7 or 8 of them, moving in that slow, purposeless way they move when they're not locked onto a stimulus, just drifting through the field. I slowed to a near stop to look. One of them turned at the engine sound and locked onto the truck, starting toward me, and I accelerated before the others could respond. In my mirror, I could see the one that had turned standing at the fence line, watching the truck go. The others resumed their drifting. 7 or 8. That was more than I'd seen in one place before, away from town. The radius was expanding. I'd had maybe another week, 2 at the outside, before staying anywhere on the surface in this county was going to mean constant contact. I moved into the bunker that evening. Moving in means something specific. It means deciding this is home now. Everything I'd done in the previous weeks had been framed as temporary, provisional, adjustable. Moving into the bunker was a commitment. I was going underground, and I was staying underground until the world above changed enough to let me out. The first night was strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent 3 days down there doing assessment and some initial work, so the space wasn't unfamiliar. But being there at night, with the hatch closed above me and only my headlamp and a battery lantern for light, was different. The darkness in a sealed concrete space is not like darkness anywhere else. There's no gradation to it. When the light is off, it's just completely black. Your eyes don't adjust because there's nothing to adjust to. You put your hand in front of your face and you cannot see it. I wasn't prepared for that. I had to leave one of the small battery lanterns on low all night, which I knew was a waste of batteries. But I needed the visual reference, or I was going to start feeling like I was falling. The sounds were different too. Above ground, silence is never total. There's wind, insects, the settling of a house, distant cars. Down here, with the hatch sealed, I could hear nothing from outside. What I heard was the facility itself, the tiny drip of condensation somewhere in the corridor, the faint tick of cooling metal. Once something that might have been an animal, walking across the hillside above and transmitting its vibration down through the concrete. And I heard myself, my own breathing, my own heartbeat sometimes. That took getting used to. I lay on one of the bunk frames. I'd brought a sleeping pad and bag for it. And I stared at the ceiling and I thought about my father. My father had been an electrician. He'd worked for the same company for 31 years, and then retired, and then died of a heart attack 14 months into his retirement. He used to say that the best thing a man could do with his hands was make something work that wasn't working. He wasn't a sentimental man. And he didn't say it like a piece of wisdom. He said it like a fact, like the way he'd tell you the sky was blue, making something work. I was in a space right now that had been something, had been functional, had been purpose-built, and had been left to become nothing for 40 years. I was going to make it work again. I thought about that. It felt like the right way to be here. It felt like the right thing to have. I slept eventually. Over the next 2 weeks I worked. I don't mean I worked casually. I mean I worked the way you work when the work has a deadline that isn't a date on a calendar, but is a shift in temperature and the growing density of things that want to hurt you on the surface. I mean I worked all day, every day, stopping only to eat and sleep, and manage the increasingly necessary bathroom situation, which I'll address without making it more dramatic than it was. The toilet worked via gravity to a septic tank buried somewhere below the facility, but without water pressure the toilet didn't flush. I rigged a manual water bucket flush from my stored supply, which is unglamorous but functional, and I added managing that water supply to my daily task list. The ventilation system first, because bad air is a faster killer than cold, and because if I was going to be down here long term, I needed to know what I was breathing. The original passive ventilation, surface vents on the hillside, negative pressure draw, was still partially functional. I found the surface vents by walking the hillside above the bunker, which I did carefully, and with the rifle in hand, and cleared the debris from them. 6 vents total, 4-inch galvanized pipe, capped with old louvered covers that had seized open or closed on their pivot pins. I cleaned them all, freed the louvers, verified that I had airflow when I went back down. Then I installed the blower fan from the hardware store in the main duct at the point where the ductwork split to serve the different rooms. This required some fabrication. The fan was newer than the ductwork and didn't match the existing collar dimensions. But I'd brought my sheet metal tools and I cut an adapter plate from some scrap I'd found in the generator room, sealed everything with the foil tape, bolted it solid. Ran the electrical back to the main panel, wired it to a circuit I'd verified was clean, put a standard wall switch in line. When I turned on that fan for the first time and felt the air move through the facility, actually felt it, the change in air pressure and the movement of dust particles, and the sense that the space was breathing. I don't know how to explain what that felt like. It felt like the bunker waking up, like it recognized what was being done to it. The water line came next, and that was the hardest physical job of the whole setup. I needed to run approximately 200 feet of half-inch flexible tubing from the creek, up the hillside to the area near the hatch, then down through a penetration I'd need to drill through the concrete wall of the generator room to connect to the storage tank's inlet line. The hillside was steep and covered in frozen ground. The creek was cold and moving fast, and I was doing this alone, which meant every step of the process had to be done sequentially by one person. I drilled the wall penetration first. I had a rotary hammer drill and the right masonry bits, and I knew the concrete was about 10 inches thick from my original assessment, so I'd need to go that deep. I used a 2-inch core bit because I wanted clearance around the tubing for a proper sealed bushing. Drilling that hole took about an hour and a half. Concrete dust filled the room. I wore my dust mask and worked through it. The trench for the water line, I dug it by hand with a standard spade through approximately 60 feet of frozen surface soil before I hit the slope, where I just lay the line on the surface and covered it with a layer of rocks and soil for weight. The frozen ground was miserable and slow. I worked in the mornings when my body was fresh and stopped at noon because I was spending too much energy. It took 3 days to get the trench dug, laying the line, connecting the foot valve at the creek end, threading the line up through the trench and through the wall penetration, connecting it to the storage tank inlet with the brass fittings and the pump inline, That was a day of careful work. When I finally had it connected and primed the pump and heard water moving, heard it flowing into the storage tank, heard the float valve click, and the flow slow as the tank filled, that was a better feeling than the ventilation. That was water. I had water. I let the tank fill completely, then ran every fixture in turn. The toilet flushed. The sink ran. The shower ran cold and brown for about 2 minutes and then ran clear. I stood in that tiny shower stall with cold water running over me, fully clothed, because I hadn't thought to undress first, and I just let it run. The generator installation took most of a day, once I'd built a simple pallet and roller system to move the crated unit down the hatch, which was its own elaborate operation involving rope rigging and its considerable amount of careful lowering rather than the assisted drop it could have been. The generator fit the tie-down points in the generator room almost exactly. The original installation had clearly used a unit of similar size. I bolted it down, ran the exhaust through an existing exhaust duct that went up through the ceiling and the hillside, connected the fuel line to the propane supply, connected the electrical output to the main panel. Through a transfer switch, I wired in. I started it for the first time on October 31st, Halloween. I know because I wrote it in the log. The noise of it starting was enormous down there. The concrete walls gave the sound nowhere to go. I'd known this would be a problem. A diesel generator at the surface is audible at a considerable distance. A propane generator in a sealed concrete room was going to be very loud. I'd already thought about this, and my solution was partly insulation. I'd lined the walls of the generator room with the heavy-duty plastic sheeting layered over a fiberglass blanket I'd salvaged from the roof insulation of the farmhouse on the first run, and partly operational timing. I'd only run the generator during daylight hours when I needed to, keep runs short and purposeful, and rely on my battery bank for power the rest of the time. The noise with the insulation in place was still loud in the generator room itself, but by the time it traveled through the sealed door and down the corridor to the living areas, it was a low thrum, more felt than heard. Acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. The lights came on. Every fluorescent fixture in the facility. The old ballasts replaced years ago, I'd swapped them for LEDs I'd salvaged from the farm supply store, which were far more efficient, came on and the place was lit. Not bright sunlight, but good working light in every room. The whole facility, lit and ventilated and watered. I sat in the main room under the lights and ate a cold can of soup and let myself feel good about this for about 10 minutes. Then I made a list of what else needed to be done. November came in hard. I'd been underground for about 2 weeks and had developed a functional daily routine that I found, if not exactly comfortable, at least predictable enough to be stable. Mornings I did a systems check, water level in the storage tank, battery bank charge state, a check on the ventilation to make sure the surface vents hadn't been blocked by leaf fall or animal activity. Then I'd eat breakfast and do whatever the day's main task was: fabrication, fortification, general improvement. Afternoons were for the quieter things: food prep, log writing, radio listening. Evenings I'd eat again, manage the water system, run the generator for a charge cycle if the batteries were low, and try to wind down enough to sleep. Sleep was still difficult. Not impossible, not desperate, just resistant. I'd lie in the dark. I'd gotten past needing the nightlight after about the 3rd week, and my brain would run its processing cycles. I'd lie there and think about the work I'd done and the work left to do, and sometimes I'd think about Carrie and the house in the city and the dog, and sometimes I'd think about my father, and sometimes I'd think about the world above the concrete ceiling and what it was becoming while I was down here making a place that was away from it. I'd found a small shortwave radio in my supplies. I'd taken it from the farmhouse, not knowing if it worked, and it did. Ray's AM frequency worked too, though the signal faded in and out. I listened in the evenings. The voice on the AM broadcast was a woman. I'd worked that out by the second listening session. She read what sounded like a prepared broadcast, twice a day, early morning and evening, giving general survival information, status reports on what she called confirmed clear zones, and encouragement to survivors to make contact. She gave GPS coordinates for what she called a relay station. I wrote those coordinates down and looked them up on a paper map I'd brought. A county road atlas that covered the full state, spiral-bound, the kind you used to find at gas stations. The coordinates put the relay station about 60 miles north, in a small city I knew vaguely. Not somewhere I could reach easily or quickly, but a destination, a direction. I also picked up 2 other signals, briefly and at intervals, that were less organized. What sounded like individuals broadcasting from home setups, voices, reading off lists, or asking if anyone could hear them. One of them was a man who gave his location, a town I recognized, about 20 miles west. He broadcast the same message every evening at the same time. "This is Owen Marsh at the Deacon County Library. I have 6 people. We have food for about 3 more weeks. We're looking for contact." Same message every evening. I wrote it down. I didn't have a transmitter, so I couldn't respond. But I wrote it down. On November 8th, I surfaced for the first time in 2 weeks. I needed to check the surface vents. I needed to check the waterline intake at the creek, and I needed to assess what the above-ground situation looked like. I'd been hearing things through the ventilation duct. Sounds that transmitted down from the surface vents, faint but present. Wind in trees. Once, something I couldn't identify that lasted about 10 seconds and stopped. Once, what might have been a voice, very distant, not repeated. I went up at mid-morning, slow and careful, lifting the hatch just enough to listen before opening it fully. The woods above were quiet. I climbed out, pulled the hatch down behind me, and stood for a moment adjusting to the daylight. The woods looked different from how I remembered them. I'd been down there 2 weeks in mid-autumn, and now the trees were mostly bare. And the light was different, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of wet brown leaves. It smelled like November, that particular damp, cold smell of dead vegetation and pre-frost air. I stood there and breathed it for a longer time than strictly necessary. The surface vents were fine. 4 of them had been partially covered by leaf accumulation, and I cleared them. 2 were clear. The water line at the creek end was intact. The foot valve was doing its job. The screen was slightly clogged with debris, which I cleaned. And when I checked the flow at the hatch level, it was good. I checked the logging road. No tire tracks other than my own, weeks old. I checked the area around the hatch. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been near the area. I sat on a log at the edge of the tree line for a while and looked out at the field below. Clear of any movement. Sky heavy and gray, the kind of gray that means snow is coming but hasn't decided when. A line of bare trees along the creek bottom 200 yards away. Silence except for wind. I went back down. That evening the AM broadcast included something new. The woman on the radio, she'd never given her name, just called herself the Relay, said that a group of survivors had arrived at what she called the North Station, and that the station was now an active community rather than just a communications relay. She said they were establishing trade routes with other groups. She gave the same GPS coordinates. She said to come. I wrote all of it down. 2 days later, on November 10th, I had company. I heard them before I saw them. It was mid-afternoon, and I was in the generator room doing maintenance on the propane connection when the ventilation duct transmitted something unusual. Not just wind and ambient nature sounds. Voices. Multiple voices. Outdoors, moving. I killed the generator immediately. Turned off every light in the facility. Stood absolutely still in the dark and listened. The voices were getting closer. 3 of them, I thought. 3 distinct voices, though I could only catch fragments of words through the duct. They were moving along the logging road, or near it. I went to the main room, collected my rifle, checked it, and sat down on the floor between the bunk room door and the exterior wall. I didn't go up. Going up meant either confrontation or commitment, and I wasn't ready to decide which yet. I sat in the dark and listened. The voices passed. They moved along the logging road in the direction I'd parked my truck. And my truck was still there, concealed in the cedars, but not invisible to someone looking carefully. Silence for 10 minutes. Then the voices again, closer now, coming back toward me. They'd found the truck. I could hear it more clearly now through the duct, the sounds of movement, something being touched or examined. A voice, male, saying something I couldn't make out clearly. Another voice, a woman's, responding. A third voice, younger, asking a question. They were at my truck. My truck was about 60 feet from the hatch. I had maybe 3 minutes to decide what to do before whatever was going to happen next happened without my input. Going up and confronting 3 strangers I couldn't evaluate carried obvious risks. Not going up and hoping they moved on also carried risks. They might find the hatch. They might damage the truck I might still need. They might camp near the hatch and block my access from above indefinitely. I went up. I opened the hatch slowly. The voices were right there. The truck visible through the cedar screen, 2 figures visible through the trees. I stood up, made sure I was clearly visible, and said, loud enough to carry but not loud enough to echo, "I can hear you. I'm not hostile. Don't do anything stupid with whatever you're holding." The response was a woman's voice, sharp and not the least bit startled. "Same." I moved through the cedar screen and they saw me and I saw them, 2 adults and a teenager. The woman was maybe 40, dark-haired, athletic build under a very dirty fleece jacket. The man was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and an arm in an improvised sling made from what looked like a cut-up flannel shirt. The teenager was a boy, maybe 15 or 16, with a rifle pointed roughly at me that he lowered when the woman glanced at him. The woman was holding a crowbar. She was not holding it at me. She was holding it the way you hold a crowbar when you're ready to use it, but haven't decided to yet. "Whose truck?" she said. "Mine," I said. "Are you alone?" "Right now," I said, which was technically true. She looked at the man with the sling. He gave a barely perceptible shrug. She looked back at me. "We've been moving for 4 days," she said. "We have 1 firearm, 60 rounds, 2 days of food, and Donald's shoulder is broken." The older man, Donald, said nothing. He just looked at me with the expression of someone who has moved past the point where pride is a relevant consideration. The boy said, "Is that food in the back of the truck?" He said it, like he was trying not to sound desperate and not entirely succeeding. I looked at the 3 of them for a while. I did the math that I'd promised myself I wouldn't let myself do. 1 woman, 1 injured older man, 1 teenager. Resources they'd bring versus resources they'd consume. Skills I could guess at versus skills I could confirm. Risk of trust versus risk of isolation. I told the math to shut up. "What's your name?" I said to the woman. "Donna," she said. "Donna Price. That's my father, Donald. That's Tyler." "I'm Dale," I said. "There's food in the truck." Come on, I should explain that decision more, I think, because it wasn't as casual as it sounds. I didn't just open the hatch to 3 strangers because I felt sorry for them. I did it because of a specific thing Donna did after I said, "Come on." She looked at the teenager Tyler and said, "Tyler, put on the safety." He did. Then she turned to her father and helped him get his arm positioned more comfortably before they started moving. Those 2 small things told me something about how she operated. She thought about the people around her before she moved toward her own interest. That's not a universal sign of trustworthiness, but it's a data point. And I was reading data points. I brought them down the ladder one at a time. Donald laughed because his arm was making it difficult, and I went up and braced him from above while he came down. I had the generator running by the time all three were down. Lights on, the facility lit and ventilated and warmer than the surface by a significant margin. Donna stood in the main room and looked around for a long time without saying anything. "You did all this?" she said finally. "It was already mostly here," I said. "Cold War structure. I just got the systems running." "What do you do?" she said. "Vac and maintenance," I said. "Buildings." She nodded slowly like that explained something. Then, "What can we do?" That right there. That question, asked within the first 5 minutes, before she'd eaten or rested or fully taken in the situation. I told you she was the right kind of person. The next week was an adjustment period. Anytime you add people to a living situation that's been working for one person, there's friction. Not necessarily hostile friction, just the friction of different habits and different assumptions and different ways of using shared space. Donna was organized and practical and picked up the facility's systems quickly. Donald was quiet and in considerable pain from the shoulder and mostly stayed on his bunk for the first few days, sleeping more than he was awake. Tyler was 15, which meant he oscillated between useful and problematic in the specific way that 15-year-olds do, and also meant he needed more than just food and shelter. He needed enough to do that he didn't start catastrophizing. I put Tyler on water management. The daily check of the storage tank level, monitoring the line from the creek, managing the bucket flush system. Simple, important, repetitive. He took to it with the kind of focus teenagers sometimes show for tasks that have clear metrics. Either the tank is full or it isn't. Either the line is flowing or it isn't. He made himself an expert on it within 3 days and started giving me unsolicited reports on the tank level like it was data he was proud of, which it was. Donna had, it turned out, been a nurse practitioner. She'd been working in a clinic in Pemberton when things fell apart and she'd gotten out of town with her father and Tyler. Tyler was her nephew, her sister's son. Her sister wasn't in the picture, and I didn't press on why. In the first chaotic days, driving away from the town and toward nowhere in particular, following roads that were passable, and avoiding the clusters she could see from the car, the arm. Donald's arm had broken in a fall 3 days in, when they'd been trying to get through a second-story window into a house they'd needed to shelter in overnight. He'd taken the fall badly, and the forearm was broken through. Not a compound fracture, but a significant one, and Donna had set it as well as she could and made the sling from what was available. He needed immobilization and time and some kind of pain management, all of which the bunker could provide better than the roadside. Donna's medical knowledge was something I hadn't had and didn't have the training to replicate. She went through my first aid kit with the thoroughness of someone reviewing a colleague as work. Not critical, just systematic. She identified what was useful, what was redundant, what was missing. She made a list of what she'd want to have, and I added it to my list of things to look for on any future surface runs. It was Donna who pointed out, about 5 days after they arrived, that we were going to have a food problem. Not immediately, not this week or next week. But I had about 60 days of food stored at current single-person consumption levels, and there were now 4 of us, which meant roughly 15 days of food. That sounds alarming, and it was alarming, though the math was slightly better than it sounded, because Donald's appetite was reduced while he was healing. And Tyler, while eating like a teenager eats, wasn't eating as much as a full-sized adult. Call it the equivalent of 3 adult portions rather than 4. That gave us about 20 days. 20 days was not enough. I'd been thinking about food as something I solved with runs. Go out, find stores, come back. The problem was that the obvious sources were increasingly depleted or occupied. The farm supply store had been cleaned further, On my third run, I'd noted that someone else had been through it. The farmhouse with the good pantry was empty now. The grocery distribution warehouse, I didn't know its status. The hardware store had never had food to speak of. The town of Pemberton itself was, based on everything I'd heard and the signs I'd seen, not a safe place to enter. I spent an evening on the bunk thinking about this and came back to the seeds I'd taken from the farm supply store. Winter wheat, kale, turnips, radishes. These weren't summer crops, they were cold tolerant. Kale and turnips could grow in near-freezing temperatures. Winter wheat could be planted in autumn and would germinate slowly through the winter and be ready in spring. I didn't have a garden. I had a sealed concrete facility, but I had the seeds, and I had the plastic sheeting, and I had the generator. It was Tyler who said it out loud before I got there myself. We were in the main room one evening and I'd been explaining the food situation in broad terms, not to scare anyone but because everyone needed to understand the constraints, and Tyler looked at the ceiling. He'd been staring at the ceiling a lot. I'd noticed the way people stare at something they're trying to think their way through, and said, "What if we grew it in here?" Donna looked at him. Then she looked at me. "Light and space," I said. "We'd need light and space." "The storage room," Donna said. "It's empty." "Generator to run lights," I said. "Continuous light runs propane. I'd have to calculate the fuel budget." "Winter wheat doesn't need a lot of light," Tyler said, with the specificity of someone who'd just remembered something. He'd told me he'd been on the school's agriculture club. Not a popular club, just one he'd ended up in because it fit his schedule. And they'd done a greenhouse module. He had fragments of knowledge about cold-tolerant crops that were imprecise but better than nothing. We designed the grow operation that evening on a piece of paper. It was rough and provisional, and we changed it 6 times before committing to anything, but we designed it. The storage room was 12 by 15 feet, with shelving on 3 walls. We'd use the floor space for growing trays made from whatever flat containers we could source, filled with topsoil we'd bring in from the surface. We'd hang the fluorescent shop lights. I had 2 new ones that were supposed to go in other parts of the facility, in the storage room, oriented downward. We'd grow primarily the cold-tolerant crops, kale, which could be harvested continuously from the same plant for weeks by taking the outer leaves. Turnips for caloric density. Radishes for fast turnaround short-term food while we waited on the slower crops. It wouldn't feed 4 people indefinitely. It would extend our supplies. It would give us fresh food, which was something we were all going to need badly in a way that went beyond calories. You can feel the absence of fresh food in a specific dull way after about 10 days on canned goods, a flatness in the body that isn't quite hunger but is something real. We needed soil. This meant a surface run. I went out on November 18th, alone, early morning. Donna had argued for coming with me. She was right that 2 people on a run was safer than 1, but Donald was still not mobile enough to be alone, with Tyler managing him, and I was faster alone because I knew what I was doing and where I was going. I drove to the nearest open farmland, fields about 3 miles from the bunker, a cornfield that had been harvested before everything fell apart, with rich, dark, turned earth ready for winter. I loaded the truck bed with topsoil, using a flat spade and working fast, filling 8 5-gallon buckets I'd brought. The field was flat and open, and I could see 400 yards in every direction, and there was nothing moving in it. On the way back, I swung through the small town of Greer, the same town where the hardware store was. I needed to check on something I'd been thinking about. The town was quiet in the way I'd come to recognize, as distinct from normal empty town quiet. Normal empty quiet is just the absence of people. Ambient sounds intact. No sense of recent activity or disturbance. This quiet was different. Several storefronts had been broken into. A car had burned, weeks ago based on the rust starting on the exposed metal in the middle of the main street. 3 of the infected were visible from the truck, 2 moving along the far sidewalk, 1 standing in an alley between 2 buildings, not moving. I drove slowly. The 2 on the far sidewalk didn't respond to my speed. The 1 in the alley turned at my engine and started moving toward the street, toward me. I accelerated past before it cleared the alley. What I'd come to look for. A farm and home supply store I'd seen on a previous pass but not stopped at, on the eastern edge of the town. It was a different one from where I'd been before. Smaller, the kind of store that sells hardware and animal feed and seeds and canning supplies. The door was intact. I parked, listened for 2 full minutes, then went in fast. The food section, small, a few shelves, was stripped completely. But the farm supply section had been left alone almost entirely. I found what I'd specifically come for: 2 seed starting kits, each with a tray of peat cells and a plastic dome cover, and a bag of seed starting mix that was finer and better than garden soil for germinating seeds. I found a bag of rabbit manure pellets, which are a gentle organic fertilizer, and a bag of perlite for drainage in the growing mix. I took 4 more fluorescent shop lights. I took a roll of Mylar emergency blanket material. We could line the walls of the grow room with it to reflect light back at the plants. I took 2 battery-powered digital timers of the kind used to control Christmas lights, which would let me put the grow lights on a day/night cycle without running them continuously. On the way back to the front of the store, I passed the hardware section and found on a pegboard hook a small hand radio, a dual-band walkie-talkie, the kind that could transmit on both FRS FreeMers and MERS frequencies, battery-powered, with a pair of rechargeable batteries and a small USB charger. I took it. If I was going to do more surface runs, having a way to communicate with the bunker made sense. And then, in the store's back office, a tiny room with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window facing the back lot, I found something that changed my thinking for the next several weeks. A spiral-bound county map, not just a road atlas, a detailed county-level map, the kind that municipalities produce for planning and surveying purposes, showing property lines, structure footprints, elevation contours, road types, well locations, water body features. It was the county immediately north of my current location. I flipped through it and found, on 3 separate pages, notation marks in pencil that someone had made at some point. Circles around certain properties, X marks through others, a handwritten legend in the margin that said, in someone's cramped print, checked, clear, date, initials. Someone had been surveying this county, checking properties, documenting what was safe. The most recent date in the margin notes was 11 days ago. The initials were 2 letters, RT. I drove back with that map on the seat beside me, looking at it at every stop sign. November moved deep and the cold deepened with it. The bunker was running warmer than I'd expected. The earth around it acted as thermal mass, holding a ground temperature of around 54 degrees, regardless of the surface temperature, and with the generator running a few hours a day and 4 people in a not large space contributing body heat, the living areas stayed in the low 60s. Cold enough to need a layer in the evenings, warm enough to function without the kind of energy expenditure that cold extraction causes in your body. Donald's arm was healing. Donna monitored it carefully, remade the splint when she felt the alignment wasn't quite right, directed Tyler and me in the exercises that would keep the shoulder from stiffening. By the end of November, he could hold a cup with the injured arm, which Donna said was ahead of schedule, and which Donald received with a nod that was probably, for him, the equivalent of dancing. Donald had been, before, a civil engineer. Roads and bridges for 30 years, with the State Department of Transportation. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was specific and beautiful. He'd assessed the bunker structure within his first week, with the eye of someone who, knew how reinforced concrete was supposed to look, and he told me that the construction was military specification, that it was in better structural condition than he'd expected for its age, and that the ceiling, which had been my main structural concern, showed no signs of crack propagation that would indicate load distribution problems. He also said, on the 8th day, looking at the ceiling with his engineer's eye, "There's a void in the hillside above us, northwest quadrant. The acoustic signature when you're in this room is wrong for full soil contact above the ceiling. Probably a natural formation that was incorporated when they built this, or a second structure." I looked at him. "A second structure," I said. "Could be," he said. "Or a natural cave partially filled with rebar and shot concrete to stabilize the roof. The 40s and 50s builders did that sometimes when they were building into hillsides. Incorporated the natural void rather than blasting it out." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "Worth checking." I'd been so focused on getting the known space functional that I hadn't thought beyond it. The idea that there might be more space hadn't occurred to me. I added it to the list. The grow room came online properly around December 2nd. By that point, we had the growing trays set up. 12 trays in total, each about 2 feet by 1 foot, on a low staging system Tyler and I had built from scrap lumber I'd brought down in one of the early runs. The trays were filled with a mix of topsoil and seed, starting mix and perlite. We had kale seeds in 4 trays, turnip seeds in 4 trays, radishes in 2 trays, and the remaining 2 trays I'd reserved for the winter wheat. Not for harvest, but for sprout greens, which can be eaten at any stage of growth and provide a nutritional density that the other crops couldn't match. The mylar lining went on the walls and ceiling of the storage room. The shop lights hung from chains. Tyler had rigged from the original shelf anchors, 5 feet above the trays, aimed straight down. The timers were set for 16 hours of light and 8 of dark, which is a forcing cycle for most cool season crops. The first germination showed on December 4th. Radishes first, they're always first. That's why you plant them, they're the impatient ones. 8 days later we had radish seedlings 4 inches tall, with the second pair of true leaves developing. I picked one and ate it whole, root and all, the raw green bite of it, the faint peppery taste that fresh vegetables have, and nothing from a can ever does. Donna looked at me eating it with an expression that was hard to categorize. Tyler asked for one too. I gave him one. We didn't pick any more for another week, letting them size up. But that one radish was important. Not as food. It was a mouthful, less than that. As proof. The system was working. The food was coming. There was a problem I'd been keeping to myself that I finally told Donna about on December 6th, sitting in the main room after Tyler and Donald were asleep. I'd been tracking the propane consumption more carefully over the past 2 weeks, now that the grow lights were adding to the electrical load. The numbers were not good. I'd been running the generator in 2 cycles per day, a morning run and an evening run, each about 2.5 hours. Plus the ventilation fan, which drew from the battery bank during generator off hours. The grow lights were on their timer cycle and added a significant load. I'd calculated the propane burn rate at 1.4 gallons per generator hour, which meant roughly 7 gallons per day for the 2 cycles. My total stored propane was approximately 280 gallons. Simple math, 40 days. 40 days. Call it mid-January. After that, the lights go out. The ventilation fan stops. The generator is useless. We could live in the bunker on battery power alone for maybe another week before the batteries depleted. Without ventilation, the air quality would degrade. Without lights, the grow room went dark and the plants died. I needed either more propane or less consumption. Or both, Donna said when I laid out the numbers. Or both, I agreed. The propane station, she said, the one you got fuel from before. Occupied, I said, but negotiable last time I checked. What about fuel efficiency? Can you reduce the generator load? I'd been thinking about this. The grow lights were the big variable load. The fans I could replace with a smaller unit. I'd actually seen, at the hardware store in Greer, a DC brushless fan designed for server cooling that drew about 15 watts and could move adequate air through the ductwork if I added a second one in series. 2 of those instead of the current blower would reduce my ventilation power draw by about 70%. The shop lights were already LEDs, which were efficient, but I could potentially reduce the daily light hours. Not all the way down. The plants needed a minimum, but maybe from 16 hours to 14. It buys me maybe a week more, I said. Still need more propane. Then we need to go to the propane station, Donna said. I need to go, I said. You stay. She looked at me with the precise expression of someone who has decided not to argue about something they haven't actually agreed to. What are you going to trade this time? Good question. On my first visit to Ray's propane station, I'd traded canned food, which we had less of now, but I had skills. Ray had a propane operation and a damaged road security setup. I'd noticed on my first visit that the vehicle they were using as a roadblock had a crack in one of the glass panels and a side mirror that was attached with wire rather than its original hardware. I was a mechanic and fabricator. Trade in labor and expertise might be more valuable at this point than trade in supplies. Skills, I said. I went on December 9th. The road to Ray's station looked different, more used. Fresh tire tracks in both directions, and at the point where the road bent before his improvised roadblock, a second vehicle had been added. A flatbed truck parked perpendicular to the first, forming a more substantial barrier. The blocking setup was more professional than before. A man I didn't recognize stepped out from behind the flatbed with a rifle and hand up in the stop gesture. Not aggressive, just alert. I stopped. He came to the window and I explained who I was, that I'd been here about 6 weeks ago, traded with Ray. He'd remember me. The man, younger, early 30s, wearing a Carhartt jacket with a strip of reflective tape on the back for some reason, said, "Wait here," and went back behind the flatbed. Ray came out about 3 minutes later. He looked the same faded orange vest, slightly more beard. He recognized me immediately and waved me forward through the gap they'd left in the barrier. The property had changed. There were now 4 vehicles parked in the lot, all of different makes and states of condition. A canvas canopy had been set up against the south wall of the main building, and under it there was a table with supplies organized on it in sections. 2 more people I hadn't seen before, a woman and a man, both older, were doing something with the supplies. It was a trading post, an actual small trading post. Ray walked me through it. In the 6 weeks since I'd last been here, 9 other groups of survivors had made contact with the station. Most had come for propane. Same as me, Ray had been fair and consistent with everyone, and word had apparently spread in the way word spreads in depleted communities. Slowly, by relay, person to person. The woman under the canopy was named Karen, and she'd been a school librarian before. She'd taken over the records keeping, which meant the spiral notebook had become a more organized ledger. The older man was her husband Paul, who had been a retired schoolteacher, and was now apparently working logistics and inventory. 9 groups. Maybe 40 people total in contact range, Ray estimated, though he hadn't met them all directly. "The radio signal," I said, "from the north." "I've been listening," he said. "I've sent a courier up there. A kid on a motorcycle, fast and light, could get through where a truck might not." He paused. He made it, came back last week. He told me what the courier had found. The radio operation in the northern city was more than just a broadcast. It was an actual settlement. About 230 people in a section of the city that they'd cleared and fortified. They had food stores, they had a fuel supply, they had a medical operation, They were actively trying to make contact with survivor groups through either the region to establish a wider network. They have a name, Ray said. They call themselves the Millbrook Settlement, after the street they're on. I sat with this for a minute. What do they want from groups like us? I said. To know we exist, Ray said, and to start talking about trade and cooperation. They're not asking anyone to move there. They're asking for contact. I told him about the county map I'd found in Greer, with the initials RT. He knew immediately. Robert Timmons, he said. He was doing surveys. He's at Millbrook now. He went up there about 3 weeks ago. He looked at me. He surveyed this property. He knows the station exists. So the network was real. It was developing around me while I was underground, and I was only partially connected to it through Ray as an intermediary. I got my propane. Ray and I worked out a different kind of deal, labor. I spent 4 hours at the property fixing 3 things that had been broken or damaged. A generator that wasn't starting reliably, which turned out to be a dirty carburetor and a loose fuel line fitting. A propane regulator that was venting when it should have been holding, which I diagnosed as a worn diaphragm and replaced with a spare from my parts collection. And the side mirror on the roadblock vehicle, which I remounted properly. In exchange, I got 2 full 100-pound cylinders and the right to come back for more on the same terms. I work on your equipment, you give me fuel. Karen, the librarian, pulled me aside before I left. She handed me a folded piece of paper. Notes from the Millbrook Courier, she said. Robert Timmons wants people to read this. I read it in the truck before driving back. The document was 3 pages, handwritten in a neat small script that had clearly been done carefully and with intent to be read. It described the Millbrook settlement in detail, their physical setup, their resource inventory, their governance structure. It described their contact network. It described what they were specifically looking for from survivor groups: skills, medical personnel, food production capacity, fuel, water access infrastructure. At the bottom of the last page, in a slightly different handwriting that I took to be a later addition, if you have mechanical or systems infrastructure knowledge, we need you specifically. Please make contact. I drove back to the bunker. December deepened. The grow room was producing steadily now. We were eating fresh kale several times a week. The turnips were sizing up. The radishes had been through 2 full harvest cycles. The nutrient density of the fresh food changed how everyone was functioning in ways that were subtle at first and then obvious. Donald's healing was accelerating. Tyler was less irritable. Donna, who had been managing everyone else's well-being with the focused attention of someone who understood the consequences of neglect, started sleeping better. I'd been out 3 more times since the propane run. Each run was more purposeful and more bounded. I went to specific targets, took specific things, came back. I didn't linger. The number of infected visible on any given surface run had increased from early November, when I might see 2 or 3 in a full hour of driving, to something closer to 8 or 10. They seemed to be accumulating in certain areas, following roads, following drainage corridors, moving generally westward. I'd been trying to understand the pattern and couldn't fully work it out, except that they responded to sound and congregated around it. And then, when the sound stopped, they'd continue in the direction it had come from, and then mill around and gradually disperse. This had implications for the bunker. The generator noise, even muffled, was transmitted through the facility and up through the ventilation pipes to the surface. Not loud enough to draw someone walking by in the woods, probably, but not silent either. I'd been watching the area around the hatch on my surface excursions and hadn't seen signs of infected visiting the vicinity, but it was a possibility I needed to keep thinking about. Donald solved this, in his way. He was in the main room one morning. His arm was now in a hard splint, He'd asked me to make from sections of flat aluminum bar I had in my materials stock, which Donna had wrapped and padded. And he was looking at the ceiling with his engineer's expression. He said, "If you were going to add a second hatch, further from the surface vents, you'd want it about 40 feet north-northeast of the current one. The soil depth there is enough to buffer the sound further, and the hillside geometry gives you a slope that would make a second exit naturally, screened from the direction infected seemed to approach from." I looked at him. "A second exit," I said. "You need one," he said. "Tactical requirement. If something compromises the current hatch, you're a box." He was right. I'd been so focused on getting the known infrastructure functional that I hadn't thought about what happens if that infrastructure is compromised. You always need a second way out. That's basic mechanical room policy. Never design a maintenance space with a single means of egress, the void he'd identified. The possible second structure or natural formation above the northwest corner of the facility. I went looking for it on December 16th. I'd been in every part of the facility many times by then, but I'd been treating the structural concrete as fixed, not something to go looking behind or through. I took Donald's acoustic observation and started doing my own survey, tapping on walls with a hammer handle and listening to the return. Solid concrete has a flat thudding note. Void behind it has a slightly different resonance, not dramatically different, but different enough if you're listening for it. I worked my way around the northwest corner of the main room, tapping methodically. 2/3 of the way along the northwest wall, between two electrical conduit penetrations, the note changed. The wall was thinner here, I could tell from the tap pattern. And behind the thinner wall, the resonance suggested a space rather than full soil contact. A space of some size. I got my angle grinder. It was noisy, and I hated using it for the sound risk. But I needed to cut a test hole. I did it in the early afternoon, maximum generator on period, so the generator noise would mask most of the grinder noise. And I used the generator exhaust timing to cover the worst of the sound. I cut a 6-inch square in the wall at head height. Cool air flowed in immediately. Not dead sealed air, moving air flowing from somewhere above, carrying the smell of rock and soil and something else, something clean and cold. I shone a headlamp through the cut hole, a natural cave, exactly as Donald had suggested. A limestone or shale void, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide, with a ceiling that came to a pointed arch, maybe 10 feet at the apex. The floor was mostly flat, with a layer of fine dust and a few small fallen rocks. At the far end, natural light, faint, gray, the light of overcast sky through a narrow slit in the rock, maybe 4 inches wide and 18 inches tall, ground level on the hillside above, an opening to the surface, small but there. I went back to Donald and told him. He said, "Well, that helps." That hole in the cave wall became, over the next week, a proper passage. I opened the cut section to a full door size, 2 feet wide, 6 feet tall, supported by a steel frame I fabricated from flat bar and angle iron I had in materials stock. I didn't cut all the way through immediately. I cut most of the way and then stopped, leaving a thin skin of concrete that I could punch through in 30 seconds if I needed a fast exit. But that didn't leave the passage obviously open. On the cave side, I reinforced the floor and checked the ceiling for loose material. The narrow surface opening at the far end I widened to about 10 inches, enough to pass a person through sideways if they had to, and set a flat stone over it from the outside to make it invisible from above. 2 exits. That changed the psychology of the space in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Before the second exit, the bunker was home, but it was also, on some level, a trap. After the second exit, it was just home. Christmas came on a Thursday. I know because I wrote it down, and also because Tyler announced it at breakfast with the forced casual energy of someone who doesn't want to seem like they care about Christmas at 15 but does care about Christmas at 15. Donna made what she called a special breakfast from our food stores, which was powdered eggs with dried onion and some of the freeze-dried mushrooms I'd found at the farm supply store, and she'd managed to make it actually taste good in a way that felt intentional and careful. Donald gave a short speech. It lasted about 45 seconds and consisted primarily of him saying that he was grateful for the shelter and the company, and that he'd spent worse Christmases. This was, from Donald, roughly equivalent to an emotional keynote address, and we all received it accordingly. I'd been thinking about what I'd learned from Ray and from the Millbrook document for 2.5 weeks at that point. I'd been having the conversation with myself that I'd been resisting having, which was the conversation about what came next. The conversation about whether staying in the bunker through the winter, and then what? Staying through the spring, and then the summer, and then what? Staying forever. Whether that was a plan or just fear with the word plan written on it. I hadn't built the bunker to live in it indefinitely. I'd built it to survive the worst of the collapse and come out the other side. The Millbrook settlement was the other side taking shape. 230 people making something work. Robert Timmons going around the county, making maps of what was clear and what wasn't. Ray at the propane station becoming a trading hub. Owen Marsh at the library in Deacon County, broadcasting the same message every evening whether or not anyone was responding. Just keeping the frequency alive. These were people trying to rebuild something. I need to tell you all something, I said that Christmas evening. Tyler was half asleep on his bunk. Donald was doing the reading he always did in the evenings. He'd brought one book from whatever they'd had in the car, a large print edition of a Patrick O'Brien novel, which he'd now read twice. Donna was doing something at the work table in the main room, organizing the medical supplies as she did periodically. All three of them looked at me. I told them about the Millbrook settlement, all of it, what Ray had told me, what the document said, what I'd been thinking about since I read it. Tyler sat up fully. Donna set down what she was doing. Donald put a finger in his book. I said, I think we have to make contact, and I think eventually we have to go there. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was processing silence, the silence of people working through implications. Tyler said, when? Not now, I said. Not until we have better information on the route and what the density looks like between here and there. Not until Donald's arm is more healed, not in the middle of the worst of winter. But I wanted to say it out loud so we can all start thinking about it. Donna said, what happens to the bunker? It stays, I said. We keep it functional. It's a resource, not just for us, for the network. A supply cache, a way station, a fallback. That's worth more than a hiding place for 4 people. Donald removed his finger from the book and set it flat. He looked at me for a long time with the same expression he'd had when I told him about the second exit. The expression that meant he'd already worked his way to the same conclusion and was confirming the path was correct. Spring, he said. Go in spring. I wrote that down. The last week of December brought the first real blizzard. I'd been watching the barometer. I'd found one in a supply run, an old aneroid barometer from a farmhouse kitchen, and I'd hung it in the main room and been tracking it daily. On December 27th, the pressure dropped fast, 14 millibars in 12 hours, and that afternoon, the surface vents started transmitting a different kind of sound. Wind in the trees above, building. By evening, the wind was loud even inside. The kind of wind that comes with a real winter system, the kind that doesn't gust. It just blows continuously and gets louder. Snow was somewhere in it. I'd checked the surface that afternoon, before the worst of it hit, and found 8 inches of accumulation from a previous system already on the ground. Another major storm on top of that was going to make surface movement impossible for several days. We were not going anywhere. That was fine. The bunker was provisioned. The systems were running, the food was growing. The storm could last a week, and we'd be okay. What the storm did do was strain the ventilation system. The wind was coming from the north and the north-facing vents. 2 of the 6 surface vents were on the north-facing slope. We're getting direct wind loading that the vent covers weren't designed to handle. I heard it as a change in the ductwork sound, a higher frequency oscillation that meant the duct was experiencing pressure variation. Then one of the vent covers failed. The louvers blew off, I found out later, just sheared at the pivot pins from wind fatigue. And the open duct started emitting snow. I knew this was happening because I started seeing moisture on the main duct where it ran through the living area ceiling, condensation forming and dripping. That meant cold outside air was moving through the duct without being tempered, hitting the warm inside air, and the dew point was being crossed. I had to fix it from inside. The duct ran from the surface vent to the main plenum in the generator room. I could cap it at the plenum end. Not ideal because it reduced my total ventilation, but manageable with the other 5 vents still functional. I went to the generator room with tools, found the duct in question, and capped it with a sheet metal cap I fabricated in about 20 minutes from scrap. While I was in the generator room, something else happened. The generator sputtered. It had been running cleanly for 2 months. Now it sputtered, ran rough for about 30 seconds, and then resumed normal operation. I stood there listening to it, hand on the housing, feeling the vibration. It ran fine for another hour. Then it sputtered again, worse. I checked the fuel line, the regulator, the air intake. Everything looked correct. I checked the propane supply. The cylinder connected to the generator was showing low pressure on the gauge. I thought I had more in this cylinder. I switched to the next cylinder, which I knew was full. The generator ran smoothly again, but the cylinder that had read low was one I'd calculated as having at least 15% remaining. At the rate I'd been running, that 15% should have lasted another 5 days. The pressure reading was saying it was effectively empty. I disconnected the cylinder and weighed it against an empty reference cylinder I'd marked. It was heavier than empty. Not 15% heavier, but heavier. About 6% remaining, not empty, but critically low, and not where my calculations said it should be. I went through my consumption logs carefully. I'd been tracking every generator run, start time, end time, approximate load. The math wasn't adding up. I was burning more propane than my calculations predicted. This can happen with propane in cold weather. The pressure drops and the effective delivery rate changes, which throws off simple volume calculations. But I'd accounted for that. Something else was consuming gas. I found it by smell. Standing in the generator room with the generator off, I smelled propane. Faint but present. The kind of faint gas smell that means a small leak somewhere in the system. Not dangerous at this level, but wasteful. I followed the smell to the fitting at the secondary cylinder manifold. A connection I hadn't made myself. It was the original installation hardware, and it had developed a slow seep at the compression fitting where age and thermal cycling had worked on the seal. I fixed it in 45 minutes. New fitting, proper thread sealant, tightened to spec. But the leak had been ongoing since I'd connected the system, which meant my total propane consumption had been higher than I'd logged, which meant my remaining supply was lower than I'd calculated. I ran the new numbers that night. Instead of mid-January as my propane endpoint, I was looking at early January, maybe 15 days. I told Donna first thing in the morning. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how much does that change things? We need more propane before January 10th, I said. Or we start making hard choices about what we keep running. What gets cut first if we can't get more propane? The grow lights, I said. Generator cycles drop to 1 a day, shorter run. Ventilation switches to natural draft. Heat management gets harder. Food production stops. We're back to the canned goods inventory, and that takes us to late February at current portions. February is survivable, she said. February on reduced calories in an unheated space in a Midwest winter is survivable, but it's hard, I said. Donald's healing needs caloric input. Tyler needs it for growth. And if we make it to February on minimum, we come out the other side depleted and dependent on running some kind of warm weather food operation immediately. She was quiet for a moment. So we need the propane, she said. I need to make a run to Ray's station as soon as the blizzard clears, I said. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it cleared on December 31st, it left the world outside looking like it had been repainted by someone with a limited palette, white and gray, and the dark verticals of tree trunks. The snow was knee-deep in the open, less under the trees. The logging road was completely buried. I went up on January 1st. New Year's, I noted in the log, though it felt like an entirely notional distinction. I stood at the hatch and looked at the snow-covered world for a long time. Then I went back in and started preparing the truck for winter driving. I'd moved the truck closer to the hatch location in November. Not right at the hatch, but about 80 feet away in a cleared area, under the trees that gave it some protection, and also made it accessible without a long exposed walk. I'd thrown a heavy canvas tarp over it. The tarp was buried under 18 inches of snow. Getting the truck dug out took 2 hours and cost me about 200 calories I didn't love spending. The truck started on the 3rd try, which was better than I'd expected given the cold. And I let it run and warm for 20 minutes before attempting the logging road. The logging road was impassable by truck. Too deep, too uneven, too many drifts. I switched to plan B. I had snowshoes in the truck's supply inventory. I'd taken them from the farmhouse on my first run, not knowing exactly when I'd need them, but knowing eventually I would. I put them on and started walking to Ray's station. 4 miles, through knee-deep snow, in snowshoes, carrying an empty 5-gallon fuel can as something to put propane in if I could get any. It was the most I could carry by hand and walking. The snowshoes worked well on the crusted surface, where the wind had packed the snow, worked less well in the deeper drifts in the low spots. It took 2 hours. Ray's station had changed more than I'd expected. There were now 5 vehicles in the lot, 4 people visible, and a hand-painted sign at the roadblock that read, "Propane, fair trade, no threats." The last 2 words with a certain emphasis that suggested they'd had to say it before. Ray came out immediately. He looked at my snowshoes and then at the single fuel can I was carrying, and I could see him doing the math. "How bad?" he said. "Got maybe 12 days of fuel left," I said. "Had a fitting leak I didn't catch until it had been running for 6 weeks. He winced. "How many people?" "4, I said. "1 injured. "Donna Price's father," he said. I looked at him. "You know her?" "I know of her," he said. "The Millbrook courier that came through here talked about a nurse practitioner who'd gone south from Pemberton with her father and her nephew. That's her, isn't it?" News traveled in this world through human relay the way it had always traveled before the telephone. Slowly, by name, person to person. Donna was already part of the network's knowledge base. We were findable. We were already, in some sense, part of something. "That's her," I said. "Robert Timmons marked your bunker on his survey map," Ray said. "Not your location specifically. He doesn't put exact coordinates for habitation sites, in case the map ends up in the wrong hands. But he marked this area as infrastructure maintained occupied. The Millbrook people know it exists." I sat down on the tailgate of one of the trucks. Just sat there for a second. "They know I exist," I said. "They want to talk to you," Ray said, specifically. He paused. "The document Karen gave you, the one that said they needed systems people, that was partly for you." Timmons figured out who was running the systems in this area when he surveyed it. He'd worked out from the operational evidence. The ventilation, the water line, the power setup. That whoever was running that bunker was someone who knew what they were doing. I thought about Robert Timmons walking through the woods above the bunker, reading the surface infrastructure the way I'd have read a mechanical room. He's a surveyor, I said. He reads landscape the way I read ductwork. He's an engineer, Ray said, or was. Transportation, same as roads and bridges. I picked up my 5-gallon fuel can. Give me as much as I can carry, I said. I'll work it off when the roads are passable. He gave me the propane. He also gave me something else, a hand-drawn map extension, done in Robert Timmons' cramped print, showing the route from this area to Millbrook with notations on what was clear and what wasn't as of his last survey pass. About 3 weeks prior, the route was 62 miles, 2 clear corridors, one marked as preferred, one as alternate if the first was blocked. I walked back through the snow with a full fuel can in each hand. He'd sent me with 2, and the map in my jacket pocket, and I thought about what spring looked like. January was long. I know that's not a specific observation. January is always long, but that particular January had a different kind of long to it, the kind that comes from being mostly confined in a defined space where the walls are always the same distance away, and the sounds are always the same sounds, and the light comes from bulbs rather than the sky. The grow room helped with this more than I'd anticipated. Spending time in the grow room, in the warmth and the full spectrum light, with the smell of actual soil and growing things, was actively therapeutic in a way I could measure by how I felt coming out of it versus how I felt going in. I'd started a journal practice that was different from the operational log. The log was facts and numbers, inventory and task completion. The journal was the other stuff, what I was thinking about, what I was worried about, things I remembered from before, conversations I wanted to have when I could have them with people who weren't in the bunker. I wrote about my father a lot in January, about the years I'd spent trying to do the work he'd taught me and not be him, not limited to the work, not defined only by what I could fix. The irony of the collapse being the thing that made the work matter absolutely was not lost on me. I wrote it out, read it back, found it wasn't quite ironic, and wasn't quite redemptive, just true. The world had broken down in a way that made maintainers essential, and I happened to be a maintainer, and here I was. That was it. That's the whole thing. Tyler started helping in the grow room more than the maintenance required. He'd go in there and just sit with the plants in the grow light, doing nothing in particular. I knew what that was. I'd done it myself. You need a place that isn't the same as all the other places, even when all the other places are only 100 feet away. The grow room was the only space in the facility that changed significantly from day to day. You could watch things grow. When everything outside the hatch was dying or already dead, watching something grow was a specific kind of medicine. We talked sometimes, Tyler and me, in the grow room. Not deep, meaningful conversations. He was 15, and I was 38, and we didn't have a lot of natural conversational overlap, but we talked about small things. He asked me once how I'd learned what I knew about buildings and systems, and I told him about my dad and the electrician work, and how I'd followed that into HVAC because I liked the complexity of air and heat, the way they behaved unpredictably enough to be interesting, but consistently enough to be solvable. He told me he wanted to study engineering if there was eventually somewhere to study engineering. I told him I thought there probably would be. I didn't know if I believed that entirely, but I believed it enough to say it and not feel like I was lying. In the second week of January, I found the weird thing, and I want to be honest about the fact that I still don't fully understand it. I'd been exploring the cave beyond the second exit more thoroughly, part practical, part restlessness. The cave was natural limestone, which meant it had been here long before the bunker was built into the hillside below it. The builders had clearly known about it and incorporated the geology into the site selection, using the natural void as a buffer layer between the reinforced structure and the hillside above. The cave had two sections I'd identified on my initial exploration. The first section was the main chamber, about 30 by 15 feet, accessible through the passage I'd opened in the northwest wall. The second section was a lower area, accessed through a narrow, natural squeeze passage in the limestone that went down at about 20-degree angle for maybe 20 feet, and then opened into a smaller room. I went into the lower section for the first time on January 11th. The lower room was smaller than the upper, maybe 15 by 10, and had a lower ceiling, maybe 5.5 feet at the apex, meaning I was ducking the whole time. The floor was more irregular, with small stalagmites starting to form from mineral-rich water that seeped through the ceiling during wet seasons. It smelled different down there, wetter, more mineral. What it had in it was crates. 6 wooden crates, stacked too high in the far corner, covered by a heavy canvas tarp that had rotted to the point of being almost lace-like. Underneath the rotted tarp, the crates were in better condition than I expected. Pine construction, sealed on every face with what looked like a tar-like coating that had kept moisture out. Each crate was about 2 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet. Each one had stenciling on the side that had faded but was readable. U.S. government property, a series of alphanumeric codes, and the number 1963. 1963. The crates had been here for 60 years, in a natural cave below a Cold War bunker, apparently unknown and undisturbed. I went back up, got my pry bar, came back down. The first crate I opened contained sealed tins, the large military ration style, with paper labels that were barely legible. I could make out crackers on one, something that might have been meat concentrate on another, one that said simply mixed fruits in faded red ink. The tins were sealed and showed no obvious damage. The second crate was heavier. It contained what turned out to be batteries, large, sealed, the old military DC cell style, each roughly the size of a small brick. I counted 24 of them. They were 60 years old and almost certainly depleted, but the design was a type I recognized from old equipment manuals. They were carbon zinc cells, which don't have the same leakage risk as alkaline, and in sealed storage in a cool environment could potentially have retained partial charge. I wasn't going to count on it, but I'd test them. The third crate. This one changed the trajectory of things more than any of the others. This crate contained equipment, sealed in wax paper wrapping inside the tar paper-lined crate. I unwrapped the first piece and found a radio transceiver, military surplus field radio, the type used in the late 50s and early 60s, designed for long-range communication, battery-powered, operating on shortwave frequencies. A transmitter, an actual transmitter. I sat in that low cave, with the dead fluorescent light of my headlamp and the cold mineral smell of the rock around me, and I held that radio and thought about what it meant. I knew this type of radio. Not personally, it predated me by 2 decades, but I'd worked on old building communication systems and I knew the frequency range and the operational principle. If I could get it functional, if the components hadn't degraded beyond recovery, this wasn't just a receiver. It was a way to broadcast, a way to talk to Ray Station directly, a way, potentially, to reach Millbrook, a way to become a node in the network rather than a listener at the edge of it. The remaining 3 crates contained more ration tins, a case of sealed chemical lighting tubes, glow sticks essentially, the old version, and a set of maps. Topographic maps, the large military survey type, covering a considerable geographic area, hundreds of square miles. The maps were printed on cloth-backed paper that had held up better than regular paper would have. They were 60 years old and the road data was obsolete. but the topography doesn't change, and good topographic maps covering our area were exactly what Robert Timmons would have wanted. I hauled all of it up to the bunker over the next 2 days. The radio. I spent 3 days on the radio. I won't walk through all the technical detail because it would take longer than I have here, and most of it wouldn't mean much without context. The short version: the radio had been stored carefully enough that the core components, tubes, transformers, capacitors, were functional, though some required the kind of cleaning and deoxidizing that careful work with the right materials could accomplish. The antenna was built into the unit, a collapsible whip type, adequate for medium-range communication. I needed to add an external antenna for longer range, which I built from wire and some hardware I had in my electrical supplies, running it up through the cave to the surface and along the hillside to a point with clear sky exposure. January 17th, I broadcast for the first time. I used the shortwave frequencies Ray had told me was being used by groups in the area, 7.215 megahertz, the one the Millbrook broadcast was adjacent to. I said simply, "This is Dale Hurst, Garfield County Bunker. I have a working transmitter if anyone can hear me. I'm trying to reach Millbrook or Ray's propane station. Please respond." Silence for a while. Then Ray's voice, not through the AM frequency I'd been listening on, but through the shortwave, crackling and thin, but clearly him. "Dale, you got a transmitter working. How in the hell?" I told him about the crates in the cave. There was a long pause. Then he laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine surprise. 63, he said. "You found their stores." "Whose stores?" "Those old installations. They sometimes had multiple cache sites. The bunker was the main structure, but they had secondary supply caches for the crews that might be stationed there, spread around the area." "You found one of the secondaries, sounds like." There was a third voice on the frequency. Not Ray's, clearer, less crackle, stronger signal. "This is Millbrook Relay," the voice said, female. "The woman from the evening broadcasts. We're receiving you, Garfield County. Welcome to the network." February arrived with a cold snap that pushed the temperature on the surface to -12 at night. And I know this not from a thermometer, but from the behavior of the water line from the creek, which froze for the first time on the 6th of the month. A partial freeze at the intake valve that I cleared by running warm water through the line from the stored supply. I built a simple insulating wrap for the intake area out of the foam pipe insulation I'd salvaged from the hardware store, and the line didn't freeze again. The radio contact with Millbrook had opened up something I hadn't anticipated. Information. Real, current, specific information about conditions in the wider area that changed how I thought about almost everything. The woman on the radio was named Elaine. She was a former network administrator, IT infrastructure, server rooms, communication systems, and she'd ended up at Millbrook partly by accident, and partly because she was very good at being useful in a crisis. She ran the radio operation with the same methodical approach she'd probably brought to server management. Scheduled contact windows, organized frequency use, a protocol for new contacts and existing network members. From Elaine and the Millbrook contact, and from other voices that I started to hear on the network as weeks went on. The overall picture of what had happened and what was still happening. The outbreak had, according to the best information anyone had, originated in a city about 400 miles east of us, consistent with what I'd gathered from early news fragments. The spread was faster than any official response could address, part because of the incubation period that allowed carriers to be infectious before they showed the aggressive behavior. The eastern seaboard had been the worst. Dense population, the worst amplifier for something that spread through physical contact in crowds. Out here, in the agricultural Midlands, the density was lower and the initial spread had been slower, which had given people like Ray and the Millbrook founders time to organize. The infected didn't navigate purposefully. They moved towards sound and light and heat in a way that was consistent with basic stimulus response, and nothing more complex than that. A large infected population in an area would gradually disperse toward whatever sensory inputs were available, which meant they followed roads and waterways and tended to congregate around anything that made noise or generated heat. In winter, the cold slowed their metabolism somewhat, not to the point of stopping them, but they were marginally less active in extreme cold, more stationary, harder to track, but somewhat less aggressive in their response time. What I learned about winter from Elaine was this. The worst of the infected density in our area had been the early fall surge, when the infected from Pemberton and surrounding towns were still mobile and dispersing in all directions. The winter had sorted a significant portion of them through cold exposure. Not all, but some, particularly those that had been infected earlier and were already in poor physical condition. The spring would bring another surge as survivors on the surface became more mobile, and as the remaining infected population, reduced but not eliminated, became more active again with the warming. This meant spring was not simple. Spring was the next challenge. I thought about this in February, lying in my bunk, listening to the facility's small sounds. I thought about what we'd built down here. Not just the physical infrastructure, though that was real and good, and I was proud of it in the way you're proud of hard technical work done right. I thought about what it represented. A place where people were safe. A place where food was growing. A place connected to a network. A place that could, if I chose to let it be more than just a shelter for 4 people, be a node, a way station, a resource for the wider effort. I had the maps from the crates. I had the radio. I had the skills. I had a functional facility with water and power and ventilation and growing capacity. What I'd been building, without fully planning to build it, was something that the network needed. Donald said it on a February evening, reading his book without looking up from the page. You know what this place could be. Yeah, I said. Supply cash and comms relay, minimum, he said. Add a medical operation with Donna, and it's a full support node. That means more people, I said. He turned a page. Yes, Donna was sitting across from me. She looked at me with the expression she sometimes had that I'd come to understand meant she'd been thinking about something for a while and was waiting to see if I was going to get there on my own. How many people can this space support? She said. I'd run the numbers already. 12 comfortably, I said. 18 with crowding. The grow operation would need to double, which means I'd need to build out the second half of the storage room and add another light bank. The water system would need the line replaced with a larger diameter tube, which I could do in spring. Power. I'd need to find a second generator or a solar supplement to run the expanded load. Solar, Tyler said, from the grow room doorway where he'd been listening. There's a farm equipment place in Greer that had solar panel kits. I saw them when we were passing through. The south-facing slope above the hatch has good exposure. I looked at him, 15 years old, and paying attention to every detail, filing it away, waiting to see if it was relevant. It was relevant. Good eyes, I said. He went back into the grow room. But he was smiling, that almost invisible smile that teenagers use when they want to show they care, but don't want to seem like they're showing they care. March started with a thaw. I went to the surface on March 3rd and found the snow retreating from the south, facing slopes, bare soil showing, the creek running fast and dark with melt. The air smelled like it was waking up, that specific smell of cold earth and decomposing leaf litter and something green trying to push through. I stood in it and took several deep, slow breaths and let my eyes go to the distance, which they hadn't been able to do for months. I saw 3 infected in the field below the woods. One of them turned toward me at my movement. I held very still and after about 2 minutes it turned away. The spring surge Elaine had predicted was going to be real. But so was the spring. I made contact with Millbrook on March 5th to discuss a first convoy trip. Not a relocation, a visit, a meeting, a carrying of the maps and the old radio equipment and the topographic survey I'd been developing of our local area, using Donald's engineering eye and my maintenance access to the surrounding terrain. A contribution, a first connection between the Garfield County bunker and the Millbrook settlement Elaine coordinated. Robert Timmons, she said, was very interested in the maps. The route, using Timmons' survey and our combined radio intelligence, was 62 miles with 2 significant problem areas. A river crossing about 20 miles out that would need to be approached carefully, and a stretch of highway near the 40-mile mark that Elaine's network reports said had significant infected presence. We'd go 2 vehicles, take the preferred corridor, travel mid-morning to maximize visibility. Donald would stay with the bunker. His arm was not ready for the vehicle travel, and more importantly, someone needed to stay with the facility, manage the systems, maintain the radio contact. He accepted this assignment with the same matter-of-fact manner he brought to everything. "I'll keep the lights on," he said. The night before we left, Donna, Tyler, and me in the 2 vehicles, truck loaded with the maps and the radio equipment and 3 weeks of propane and some of the grow room output as trade goods. I sat in the main room alone after everyone else was in their bunks. I looked around the space, the lights I'd installed, the ventilation system I'd rerun, the grow room door with the warm light leaking under it, the main panel with all its circuits working, the water tap in the bathroom that ran clean cold water when you turned it. I'd come down here alone in October with a headlamp and a rifle and the smell of old air, and I'd made it work. My father would have said, making something work that wasn't working, like it was a fact, like the sky was blue. I wrote in the log March 9th, heading north in the morning, facility in good condition, all systems nominal. Coming back, I closed the log. I turned off the main room light and sat for a moment in the dark. In the particular darkness of a sealed concrete space that I'd learned, over these months, was not the darkness of a grave. It was the darkness of a place that was resting, that would be here when I got back. The darkness of home. Then I got up, went to the grow room, checked on the kale. There were new leaves unfolding at the center of each plant, the pale yellow-green of very young growth just reaching for the light. And I turned out that light too and went to bed. The drive north started at 7:30. The convoy was 2 vehicles. My truck in front, a Jeep that Donna had field restored over the preceding weeks using parts from an identical model she'd found, abandoned about 2 miles from the bunker. The Jeep had been sitting on a flat tire with a crack-wanked windshield and a dead battery, and Donna and Tyler had hauled it back to the logging road over 2 days using a come-along and a lot of patience. I'd replaced the battery and plugged the tires, and now it ran, which was more than I would have expected when I first saw it. Tyler drove the Jeep. This was nominally my decision, and honestly Tyler's insistence. He'd been practicing on the logging road for a month, starting from my very basic instruction and developing into someone who could manage the vehicle competently on uneven terrain. Donna rode with him, which meant they had a firearm in the lead vehicle and a firearm in the follow vehicle. The first 10 miles were familiar. The county roads I'd used for runs all winter, the landscape altered by the retreating snow to show things I hadn't seen since fall. The bare field, structures, the tree lines, the creek corridors, more infected visible than in winter. Not a wave, not a horde. Individuals in pairs, moving slowly in the warming temperature, oriented toward road noise. We passed 2 of them on the county road within the first 5 miles. Both turned toward the vehicles. Neither posed a threat. They were 50 yards off when we passed and couldn't close that gap before we were gone. I kept my speed at a steady 40 and didn't vary it. At the edge of county on the highway that would take us north, we found something unexpected, a group of people. On the road, stationary. I slowed. Donna's Jeep slowed behind me. There were 8 of them, 4 vehicles among them. They were pulled off to the shoulder, facing north, not moving. As I got closer, I could see why they weren't moving. The road ahead was blocked, not by infected, not by a vehicle, by a pileup, the remnants of a multi-car accident from months ago. 3 or 4 vehicles locked together across both lanes in a way that left no vehicle gap, but might have a pedestrian gap. I pulled up alongside the nearest stopped vehicle. A man got out, mid-40s, heavy jacket, cautious but not hostile. He introduced himself as Jeff. Jeff was trying to get to Millbrook. He'd heard about it from a group he'd been with further south, and when that group fell apart in February, he'd started moving north on his own and picked up the other 7 people along the way. People who were also heading toward the radio signal, toward the settlement, toward the thing that was taking shape up the road. 8 strangers, none armed beyond a couple of hunting rifles, none in great condition, all of them with the particular look of people who'd been moving for a long time through a world that was trying to kill them. I looked at Jeff. I thought about the math I'd done once before and told to shut up. I know a way around the pileup, I said. Farm road about a mile back, comes out on the other side. Follow me. He looked at the truck, at me, at the Jeep with Tyler behind me. Why, he said. Not hostile, just genuinely asking why a stranger would help. Because you're trying to get to the right place, I said. And because I know the roads. He got back in his vehicle. I led the convoy around, farm road, through a field, back to the highway north of the pileup. 8 vehicles now instead of 2. 16 miles from Millbrook by Timmons' map. The last 16 miles, I'll tell shorter, because the telling doesn't need the weight of all the earlier miles. We passed through the area Elaine had flagged as a problem zone, and it was. 8 or 10 infected visible at road level. One group of maybe 12 in a field to the east, all of them orienting toward the convoy as we passed, but none of them in a position to intercept us at our speed. We kept moving. The road was clear beyond that point, cleared deliberately. I could see the signs of it, tree branches cut back, debris swept to the shoulder. Someone had been maintaining this road. At mile 58, a truck came toward us. 2 people in it, armed, not hostile. A Millbrook escort. They'd been monitoring the road traffic on the radio. They knew we were coming. They fell in behind the convoy and we drove the last 4 miles in a loose group of 10 vehicles, 18 people, heading north. The Millbrook settlement was not what I'd imagined, which was good, because what I'd imagined was either too small or too organized. It was neither. It was alive. It occupied 6 city blocks of what had been an ordinary residential neighborhood in an ordinary mid-sized city. Ordinary until the people who had been in those houses cleared and fortified them and started doing what people do when they have a structure and the will to hold it. The perimeter was marked by vehicles and welded steel barriers and lengths of fence combined with improvised hedgerow barriers. Rough, functional, clearly built by people solving a problem rather than engineers executing a design. Inside, people, 200 and something of them, working, moving with purpose, doing the unglamorous labor of maintaining a living community. A food operation in what had been a community garden, expanded by the same kind of grow-light setup I'd built, though larger. A fuel storage area, behind a school building. A medical station in what had been a clinic. A radio room in what had been an office building's first floor. Elaine met us at the gate. I recognized her voice immediately, which was a strange feeling, knowing a voice before a face. She was smaller than the voice suggested. Sharp eyes. A set of antenna feedline clips hanging off her jacket pocket like she'd been mid-installation when the convoy was sighted. Dale Hurst, she said. That's me, I said. Robert Timmons has been waiting to look at those maps since February, she said. Let's not keep him. I unloaded the maps, the old radio equipment, the survey notes. Robert Timmons was in his 60s, a big, quiet man with the permanent squint of someone's who spent his working life reading landscape from a distance. He spread the topographic maps on a table and stood over them in a silence that lasted several minutes. Then he said, "These are the blanks we couldn't fill." He pointed to several areas. "We had coverage here and here, but not the corridor between them. This fills it." He looked up at me. "Where'd you find them?" "Cave below the bunker," I said. He nodded like that made perfect sense. He knew things I didn't know. He'd been moving through the area for months, building a picture. The survey he'd been building wasn't just a map of what was clear, it was a map of what could be rebuilt. Which properties had water, which had fuel, which had the kind of infrastructure that could support a community. His notation of the Garfield County bunker as a support node wasn't speculation. He'd read the surface evidence and worked out what was below it. "You need to come back," he said. "Not to stay. I know you need to get back to your facility. But you need to come back in spring with more people and supplies. We're setting up a supply relay network and your location is exactly where a midpoint node needs to be." I thought about that. I thought about 16 people coming home with me. About the bunker with its concrete walls and its grow room and its clean running water and its second exit. "How many people?" I said. "How many can you handle?" he said. I thought about the space, the water system, the power budget, the food production. I thought about what I'd need to expand it. "Give me until July," I said. He looked at the map. He drew a line from the bunker location to Millbrook and back. "July," he said. "We'll have trade running by June. You'll have what you need." We stayed at Millbrook for 2 days. I won't try to describe those 2 days fully, because I'm not sure I have the right words for what it felt like to be in a place with 200 people who were doing something instead of just surviving. The noise of it, the density of human activity, people talking, people arguing, people doing work with their hands in the specific focused way of people who know the work matters. Tyler didn't sleep the first night. He just sat up in the room they'd given us and looked out the window at the lights. They had lights, a generator operation and a bank of solar panels on the community center roof. And I heard him say very quietly, to nobody in particular, just to himself, "It's still going." We left on the morning of the 3rd day. The same route back, clearer now because we knew it, and because Timmons had given us updated corridor information. Jeff and 2 of the people he'd been traveling with came back with us. They'd been asked to, and they'd agreed, because Millbrook needed people distributed through the network, not all congregated in one place. Jeff had been a carpenter before. One of the others, a woman named Carol, who was maybe 50 and had barely spoken during the whole trip, had been a biology teacher. The third was a young man named Patrick, 22 years old, who had, he said, was no skills in particular, but was willing to do whatever needed doing. I thought about Patrick. I thought about what I'd been at 22. Working for Trident Mechanical, learning systems, starting from no skills and becoming someone who could keep things running. I thought about what Patrick might become in a world where the things that mattered were the things that kept people alive. "Can you learn mechanical work?" I said. He shrugged. "I can learn anything that matters," he said. That was the right answer. We drove back through the same roads, past the field where I'd seen the infected, past the highway with the cleared shoulders, past the county line and the farm roads and the logging road and up through the woods to the spot above the hatch where my truck fit between the cedar trees. Donald met us at the hatch, standing at the top of the ladder with his arms folded, the good arm and the healing arm. "Everything working?" I said. "Everything working," he said. I went down first. The familiar smell came up to meet me. Concrete and grow-light warmth, and the faint humidity of the water system running. The lights were on. The ventilation was moving. The kale in the grow room was 3 inches taller than when I'd left, which is what kale does when you're not watching it. Home. I sat in the main room for a while after everyone was settled. Jeff and Carol and Patrick were in the accommodation room. Taking in the space, Donna was briefing them on the systems. Tyler was in the grow room. Donald had gone to make tea. We had real tea, a luxury item I'd found tucked in the back of a pantry on a run in December, still in sealed packets. He brought me a cup without asking if I wanted one. I took it. The heat of it, the smell of it, specific and real. I opened the log to a new page. March 11th, I wrote. Back. Jeff, Carol, Patrick arrived. Full complement now, 7 people. Systems nominal. Propane at 40%. Grow room producing. Millbrook contact established. Supply relay scheduled. I looked at the page for a second. Then I wrote, going to need more lights. I closed the log. Outside, 60 feet above me and a winter away, the world was beginning its slow attempt to repair. It wasn't there yet. It might not look like anything I recognized when it got there. But it was moving. And down here, the air moved through the ducts, and the water ran to the fixtures, and the lights were on, and 7 people were going to make it to spring. That was enough to keep working toward. That was what it had always been about. Not the bunker itself, not the walls or the systems or the technical solutions. The systems were just the way. The thing the systems made possible was this: people in a space that worked, making it to the next thing and the next thing after that. My father was right. The best thing you can do with your hands is make something work that wasn't working. I thought about that dog, Gary. I hope Gary found somewhere warm,